Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dr. Lisa Gantz. I'm one of our committee leads with the AAP California 2 Immigrant Health Committee. And we are so honored to welcome Dr. Caleb Dresser for our talk tonight. I just want to go over a few quick housekeeping issues before we begin. Zoom rules apply. Please be sure to mute yourself if you are not speaking. We are going to have an interactive portion later, and at that time, cameras and audio is welcomed. Our agenda for tonight, we're going to be doing a very brief introduction. Then we'll be hearing some remarks from Dr. Dresser for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll be transitioning over to hopefully a very interactive and engaging question and answer session. So as you're listening to the talk and hopefully after you RSVP'd, we encourage you to think about questions that you have, experiences that you've had with the intersection of these two subjects in your clinic, challenges that you faced, resources that you either already use and want to share or are looking for. This is a joint effort, a talk that we put together between the Immigrant Health Committee and the Climate Change Committee in our AAP California 2 chapter, because we know these issues are so intricately linked, and it is obviously a very increasingly important topic right now. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our wonderful speaker, but feel free to also put some questions or comments you have in the chat during. We will be monitoring that. And if you think of a question, we will note it, but then save it for the question and answer portion at the end. So Dr. Caleb Dresser is an emergency physician at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston and an instructor at Harvard Medical School. He's assistant director of the Fellowship in Climate Change and Human Health and is affiliated with the Harvard FXB Center for Health and Human Rights and the Center for Climate, Health, and Global Environment at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. His research focuses on understanding the health implications of climate-related disasters and human mobility, and he is actively involved in efforts to educate healthcare workers, policymakers, and the general public about the value of action to protect human health in the context of the ongoing climate crisis. Please join me all in welcoming Dr. Dresser.
Thank you. Great to be here, and thank you for taking a few minutes tonight to talk and think about these intersecting issues. I'm going to spend about a half hour talking about climate change, our health, human migration, and how these things fit together and impact our practice as clinicians. I also want to emphasize that I can provide my perspective and I can provide some science and some stories and some context, but that everyone on this call probably has lived experience relevant to these issues. And so I would urge you to share that if you think it is relevant to the people around you. I am obviously practicing in emergency medicine in the Northeast, and so there may be some perspectives I don't have that colleagues of yours who are on this call do. And so while I'm happy to take questions at the end, and certainly will, I would also encourage you to perhaps speak up if you think you have a useful answer to anything we've talked about, because I think this is a complicated issue and we all have pieces of the solutions. So with that in mind, I want to start with a case. And this is something I think many of you have probably already seen, or variations of something you've already seen. So this would be an 11-year-old female coming in with asthma to a health center she has never been to before, with wheezing and coughing and shortness of breath, and she's run out of her inhalers and is having a mild asthma exacerbation and doesn't have inhalers, needs a refill, maybe needs a breathing treatment in the office before she goes home today. And when you start gathering a little bit of social history, her hometown is not where you are right now, and her hometown now looks like this. And she is one of many people experiencing respiratory disease or disease exacerbations from fire-related smoke. And this is increasingly a common issue in California and in large parts of the rest of the world. There's a pretty significant impact on respiratory health in both pediatric and adult patients. And in this particular scenario, you might imagine you give her breathing treatment, refill the inhalers, she goes home, she does okay. But this is a complicated context because this is not just one fire or one day of bad air. This is a climate crisis, and we are dealing with an escalating burden of impacts from it. And so you might imagine that a couple of months later, you might see this same girl in clinic again, this time without respiratory disease, but with concerns about perhaps a mental health issue or possibly a safety or violence issue at home. She's having irritability, poor sleep, crying spells, and has remained away from her home, away from her familiar places, familiar school, familiar friends, and is trying to navigate a new situation. And in this example, this is someone who has not crossed any state lines or international borders. This is someone who may have moved a couple of counties to stay with family while dealing with the impact of a wildfire. And that can be enough to really set off some health impacts. So with that in mind, I think we need to sort of figure out how to frame this issue in a way that we can understand in terms of cause and effect and in terms of how to talk about it. And then we can think through what this means for us as clinicians who are caring for patients in a changing climate that is impacting their health and is also increasingly contributing to human mobility decisions at a variety of scales, ranging from moving a short distance for a short period of time to continental or transcontinental migration that is one way and permanent. So in terms of what we're going to go through today, we're going to talk a little bit about the mechanisms of climate change, what the health impacts are in a very broad brush approach, because that's several lectures of its own if we really wanted to go into detail. And then we're going to talk about mobility and the decisions that go into whether to move or not and how much agency people may have over that. We're going to talk about some of the factors that go into those decisions: economic, social, medical, climatologic, and a little bit about how to talk about it, some of the terminology. Are we talking about migrants? Are these refugees? What do those terms mean? How do we talk about this at different scales? And then we will close with a little bit of how this connects clinically and with a discussion. So in terms of the mechanisms of climate change, I have condensed this into one slide because I think if you're attending this talk, you probably could explain it perfectly well to me. We have been burning a lot of fossil fuels. The result is rising CO2 and methane levels in the atmosphere, and these, along with other greenhouse gases, act as an insulating blanket. They trap heat, and the result is rising temperatures. And we have already observed about 1 degree centigrade of global temperature increase, and we will see quite a bit more over the course of our careers. How much we see, that depends on what we do. And while this is not a talk on climate change mitigation and how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I think it is very important to point out that everything we are about to talk about can be made worse or better with the decisions we make about our energy system and greenhouse gas emissions. With that in mind, what we're on track for right now is some fairly significant impacts. And these range from changes in biome, changes in sea level, changes in ocean acidity that affect things like shellfish productivity, all the way up to more acute events like heat waves and wildfires and hurricanes and droughts that can have pretty substantial health impacts and socioeconomic impacts at a fairly acute rate. The first of those that I want to talk about is heat. I think this is a pretty significant issue throughout the continental United States right now. And I want to emphasize this is something we are already dealing with. The graph on the left is the average number of heat waves per year by decade. This is data from the US Global Change Research Program. And importantly, this is not a computer model. This is just a presentation in a bar graph of historical temperature data. This is just what did the thermometers say when you start looking at the definition of a heat wave. So we have already seen pretty significant increase in the number of heat waves nationally. This is expected to continue in an accelerating fashion in the years to come. Another issue, which I'm sure all of you could teach me a lot about, is wildfire. It is important to emphasize here that this is partly a climate change story and partly a human development and settlement decisions story. And issues like how you settle and develop a wildland interface affects fire ignition rates and the impacts of fires. But there is also a substantial portion of this that is attributable to climate change in the form of rising temperatures, lower moisture during summertime burns, and in some cases, higher moisture during the winter, which produces more fuel stock for fires. And so the fires are obviously hugely dangerous and problematic. And I think it's worth emphasizing that the smoke is also a big issue. And if we think back to that child in the case at the beginning of this talk, the smoke is going to affect a lot more people than the flame for any given fire. And we now have a very strong literature in this country on air pollution and particulate matter and things like strokes and neurologic disease and heart disease and respiratory disease, which in children is, I think, going to be one of the major ways that this makes itself felt. And this air quality issue is not simply one of fires. I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the things that continue to happen in our society, like burning diesel and gasoline in internal combustion engines on highways, also are affecting people's health. This is imagery from a paper that looked at, I believe, Oakland, and was mapping particulate density and various other air pollutants near intersections. And so it is worth remembering that a lot of the things we do now to get away from burning fossil fuels can have immediate health benefits. That is its own talk on health co-benefits, which is also worth engaging on. In the US Northeast, where I'm practicing, one of the big things we're dealing with is extreme rainfall. One of the hospitals down the road from the community emergency room where I have my sort of satellite site where I practice part-time actually flooded a couple of years ago in an extreme rainfall event that was well outside the bounds predicted by the historical climate norms in New England. And so I now see 30% more patients in our emergency department in that little tiny satellite ER. And I attribute that every day that I'm dealing with it to this increase in extreme weather events. So this is happening now. And again, the map we're looking at here is historical data from the US GCRP. So as we map this out into the future, and this is an image pulled from the most recent IPCC report, things are looking a little bit challenging right now. But I think it is also important to re-emphasize as we talk about these really challenging topics that we have agency over how this goes, and that the difference between the different colorful lines on the right-hand side of this graph, in this case looking at sea level, is enormous. That's 100% difference between the reasonably probable good outcome and the reasonably probable bad outcome. And so efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, decarbonize the healthcare system, decarbonize transportation, have a lot of benefit when it gets to the human impacts we are about to talk about. Because those are pretty significant. And we are already seeing some impacts on people and their migration or mobility decisions. And we are going to see a lot more in the years to come, particularly if we continue to emit large amounts of greenhouse gases and have a higher temperature climate change scenario. In terms of framing how we think about this, I have literally copy pasted a colleague's slide here with her permission. This is from Dr. Benveniste at the Harvard University Center for the Environment, because I think she had the best single image description of how to talk and think about mobility and climate change. This is based on some work from the World Bank a couple of years ago in Groundswell, which is worth a read. It's about 70 pages if you are looking to get into more depth on how this issue is being thought about. And I think the table speaks for itself, but it's worth spending a couple of minutes discussing. The basic idea is that as people deal with climate change, whether that's crop failures or flooding or heat or something else, there is a stress, and it's a stress that might be on their health, it might be on the means of their livelihood. And there are 4 possible responses to that stress. And as you go up on this graph, people are moving further distances. As you go to the right, they have more agency over what happens. And so for populations that are impacted, many times the most obvious thing that people try to do is adapt to what's going on. And so if you're living in a river delta growing rice, that might mean growing deep water rice that can survive intermittent flooding, which has been quite successful in parts of Bangladesh. And so you can have situations where people simply adapt to the impacts of climate change. That's a pretty good outcome, all things told. They remain in their community, they remain with their social network of people that are around them, and they continue to have health and livelihood. The problem is that that is not always possible, either because of resources or because the threat is too great to adapt to. Very hard to adapt to a rising sea on a floodplain after a certain point. And so in those situations, populations may move. And if they move, it may be as a choice where there is some money invested in moving to a place where a better livelihood is possible, better life for their family, better future opportunities. And that might be thought about as migration. And we're going to talk about what that word means as compared to refugees in a few minutes. But that, again, may lead to a good outcome in some cases, or it may not. It may increase vulnerability. But on the lower agency side of this, the left-hand side of the panel, we get some really concerning outcomes where you either have populations that are heavily impacted by climate change, but do not have the means to adapt and do not have the means to leave, in which case they are trapped. And this has been documented in some settings, particularly smallholder agriculture in remote rural areas where there is limited transportation, limited access to urban areas that they could move to. And this is really challenging to deal with. And in populations who can move, they will sometimes be displaced without much agency over where they go or with what endpoint. And these can be highly vulnerable populations that may be in extremely high risk situations, socially, medically, etc. So this is the framework I'm using. As we're talking about this in this talk, a lot of what we're going to be looking at is the mobile decisions where populations have moved, whether voluntarily or not. But it's important to remember that some mobility does not involve moving. And that's also either a decision or a thing that people get forced into. We're now going to go through a fairly lengthy list of things that are pushing or pulling people or trapping them in places where they may be impacted by climate change. So the first is heat. We already talked a little bit about this, and I will just emphasize that this is usually, from a health standpoint, something that by the time it's causing heat stroke or significant population level health effects, you can't really get out of there in time. It's a immediate hours to days kind of impact. But as you get recurrent heat waves, people may attempt to get out of a situation they perceive as unsafe. I am not aware of that having been documented as a cause of migration yet, but it's certainly a long-term health threat that we need to stay attuned to. Sea level rise is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of the rate of change, in that it is a very gradual process. The challenge here is that when you get things like cyclones and storm surges, you do get these acute flooding events that can be extremely deadly. And the fact that people have historically largely settled on the coast of oceans means that a huge fraction of the Earth's population is in settings that will be impacted either directly by sea level rise or indirectly by the movement of people, businesses, et cetera, out of places that are starting to intermittently flood. So that is an issue both in Bangladesh and also in this photo in Miami, which is already seeing declines in the appreciation of property values in places below a meter above sea level. And so this is a here and now issue that is likely to accelerate. And it's not an it's not only a coastal issue dealing with too much water. You also get quite a lot of freshwater flooding in places that are seeing either tropical cyclones and hurricanes or some of those extreme weather events that I was referencing earlier, for example, where I'm in New England. And those can be extremely damaging, whether to urban and suburban infrastructure or to crops. And so that has the potential to affect not only health through things like infectious disease outbreaks after flooding events, but also to affect whether people can sustain themselves and maintain their livelihoods in the place where they live. And unfortunately, climate change is an issue of extremes. And while some parts of the world are getting increasingly wet, others are getting increasingly dry. And so whether you are a farmer trying to get crops to grow in a place that has no more water, or you are living in an urban environment that has no running water supply and where you buy water from people selling it out of tanker trucks. The reality is that this is becoming a huge stress. And if you look at the proximal causes of mobility that has been seen thus far, and that we're going to look at later in this talk, a lot of the stuff we've seen so far boils down to drought making agriculture impossible, leading to movement into urban areas, which are not always a particularly good place to live. And this agricultural issue can be really bad, whether you are looking at a low and middle income country setting or a wealthy country setting. This suicide increase in farmers in India that's mentioned in the article on the left, well, they've seen a very similar effect when they started doing mental health studies in Australia among large landholders who were farming either crops or sheep. And so this is an issue that cuts across cultures and geographies. So all of these things can push people into movement. And there is a hotly debated, unsettled conversation around whether this is contributing to political instability and armed conflict or violent conflict. The number of books on this and movies on this, so this is a sampling I put up here in front of you for illustrative purposes, is quite extensive. The science is much less settled. This is a graph pulled from a 2013 paper that one group of people wrote doing a meta-analysis trying to link climate-related stressors with the outbreak of armed conflict or violence. And they found a statistically significant effect and published it in Science, and the rebuttal analyzed the same data set and said, with a slightly different set of assumptions, no, there's no effect here. So that leaves those of us who are not specialists in that particular academic field to say, well, what do we do with this information? And I think my answer is to say, well, it sounds like it matters some of the time in some places, depending on the situation. And that, as we have all been learning this year, the outbreak of armed conflict is unpredictable. There are enormous levels of complexity that play on social history, historical, political, historical issues that may be unrelated to climate change. And climate change in some cases can provide a proximal stressor that may contribute to the outbreak. But there isn't a hard and fast rule there, but it's something that we need to be aware of. On the subject of armed groups, one of the big ways this is playing out, and I think the literature I referenced a couple of slides ago, in which you have increasingly large numbers of books and movies talking about climate change leading to violence and movement of people, is that there's increasingly concern from a variety of governments and other groups that huge numbers of people will be moving across international borders. And this has led to a number of different areas in the world, and these are two examples that are not the US border that I think are worth pointing out. This is happening globally. Where one country sees the potential for population movement from another and is taking steps to prevent that using force. And so this is what a lot of people are facing when they are trying to figure out what to do as their livelihood becomes untenable. And I think it's important to emphasize that the ability to move really depends on all of these other obstacles that are in the way and on the resources that you have at hand. So taking, for example, this quote on the right from the UN, it's actually quite expensive to get yourself across international borders in search of a better life. And that is out of reach for a lot of the people who are being impacted by climate change. And so for many populations, they may not be able to take long journeys. And when you look at this, getting numbers on any of this quantitatively is very difficult. But the general understanding right now is that something like 90% of the migration, so when people do move, most of that movement is within countries. It might be from rural to urban. It might be from one region to another that is from a less to a more habitable area as threats change. But there are a lot of reasons not to move. And in addition to the cost and the challenges of crossing borders, there's also the issue of loss of community, loss of jobs, loss of livelihoods. And for anyone who's trying to understand this, I would highly recommend, I can share the slides after this with the links and everything. I would highly recommend the New York Times article I pulled these quotes from, which is simply a series of interviews with people who are either rebuilding or trying to rebuild in a community that had just burned to the ground in the Pacific Northwest. And the theme that I got out of reading these was that community matters, and that the act of being displaced or migrating to a new place without your community is traumatic, dangerous, and leaves you open to a host of different psychosocial impacts and health impacts. And a lot of people try to avoid that if they can. So that said, there will be increasing pressure. Biomes are shifting. This is the most apolitical map of the US I could come up with for climate change and shifting biomes. This is literally what you get on the packet of seeds that you plant in your garden that says, what time of year should I plant these? And this had to be updated because the growing season for carrots has changed. And that also means the growing season for things like ticks that carry Lyme disease and mosquitoes has also changed. And so that's an issue we will be dealing with in various ways. What this all adds up to is the potential for some places to get maybe a little bit easier to live in if they used to be cold and are getting warmer and maybe have a better growing season. And the potential for a lot of other places where much of the world's population is concentrated to get much more difficult to live in, whether from sea level rise, fires, or other issues. This is, again, a single image pulled from a paper showing percentage increase or decrease in projected GDP in a computer model that I quite frankly do not understand and cannot speak to, but I include here because I think it is a useful illustration of what people are thinking about globally in terms of the habitability of the planet in different regions. And unlike a butterfly or a bird that can simply migrate into a new location as biomes shift, it's much harder to cross all those little black lines on this map as a way to adapt to climate change because they're increasingly militarized or otherwise difficult to cross. So something to keep in mind in terms of, is migration an adaptive strategy to climate change? And if so, what are we doing or not doing to make that effective? Which brings us to a little bit of a conversation about who are these people and how do we talk about this issue? Are they refugees? My answer is probably not in most cases. And this is tough because I think the word refugee carries a lot of cultural resonance, and also in this particular issue carries a very specific legal definition under international law. And this is based out of the experience of the world in World War II and is entirely about fear of persecution. And so to qualify as a refugee, to apply for political asylum, you have to have a reasonable concern that you are being persecuted and it is unsafe to return to your home country, which for someone who has lost their home and the beach has been washed away where they used to fish is maybe not accurate. No one is personally going after them for their political or religious beliefs or their sexual orientation, but they also can't stay where they are. And so the terminology of refugee is a very specific subset of the groups of people who are on the move globally. Another word that comes up pretty frequently is migrants or migration. And, we titled the talk the way we did for a reason. But this is also not necessarily descriptive of what some of these folks are going through. And if you remember back to that two-axis graph that I borrowed from my colleague at the Harvard Center for the Environment, she had split this into high and low agency. Do they have a choice over this or not? And migrants, at least under the UN definition, are people who had some kind of a choice about what happened. They are perhaps migrating for the summer to work, picking some fruit in a field, or they are migrating for the rest of their life to work in engineering in the United States, but they're choosing it. And they may be getting a better life, but it was a choice. One of the better definitions that I've come across and that has gained some traction in this space is distress migration. So this originally came out of the UN FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. And the idea here is that it is not a political persecution issue. These are not refugees, but that these are people who have no other viable option other than to move. In other words, they're moving and it's not a choice. And so distressed migrants might be people whose land has turned into desert and you can't stay there, so you got to go somewhere else. And where they go and what happens next gets really complicated because being a distressed migrant does not give you the same political protections as being a refugee. You are lumped in with the people who are voluntarily moving in search of a better life. And what this has meant in practical terms is that a lot of people move the distance that is achievable to them to the point where they can build some kind of a life, which is largely from rural to urban, from highly impacted by climate change to perhaps still highly impacted by climate change, but in a different way that may be more survivable. And if you start talking to people who have migrated across international borders, often movement to a capital city or major urban center is the first step in that process and maybe a holdover point for years. So I want to share a couple of case studies and then close fairly soon so we can have some time to talk about this together. So just to give one example that I think is pretty relevant to California, there is a fairly reasonable narrative if you look at the climate data and what data there is about migration, which is obviously very challenging to get good numbers on. Looking at the dry corridor in Central America, which has seen pretty significant increases in temperature over the last few decades and increased drying, partly related to rain shadow from mountain ranges. But the result has been that for a lot of smallholder farmers growing maize or other crops, they had a series of bad seasons in the 20-teens. And one bad season, well, maybe you can replant next year and try again. Two bad seasons and you're unable to move forward. You're selling your farm equipment. You no longer have the capital to continue that livelihood. And so the result is movement into urban centers in a lot of cases when life on farmland becomes unsurvivable. And when this is looked at in aggregate, the people who have started trying to model this get the sense that this is the trend that will continue. And depending on border policies, there will be either large or very large increases in urban dwellers in Latin America, as well as increased pressure to migrate in search of more sustainable livelihoods to the north. Within the United States, there is also starting to be a conversation about where do people think they're going to want to live as the climate changes. This is very hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. What everyone is doing is taking climate data and modeling impacts on socioeconomics, which is obviously fairly fuzzy math. But there are starting to be measurable trends already, for example, in the real estate prices in Miami that do reflect climate change signals. And so I think even domestically in the United States, we need to be prepared for some populations that may be on the move, whether it's a distance of a couple of miles or a couple of thousand miles. And taking this back to the clinic, what that means for all of us is we need to be ready to take care of these people. I want to show you for a comparison point what this looks like if you're taking care of a refugee. So if you apply to the United States for political asylum, assuming that the system is functional and you go through the process in a timely fashion, we all know that may or may not be the case, there is a process that includes things like medical screenings and immunizations and sponsoring agencies and attempting to link you up with community organizations and the healthcare system wherever you wind up being placed. And so there is a process to try and have people land on their feet with someone who is there to help. That only happens if you are a refugee in the legal sense of the word. And so for people who might be distressed migrants or have been a distressed migrant, moved into an urban area in another country, and then chosen to migrate, those are not available. And so what you may be dealing with is fundamental issues in which people do not have access to care, may be either unable to pay for it or unwilling to enter a place where people are going to take down their name and date of birth and put them into a computer. And you're also going to be dealing with language issues. I imagine many of you speak much better Spanish than I do. But this is an issue everywhere in the United States now. We have a significant Portuguese population here in the Northeast now. And the ability of hospitals and clinics to provide effective interpretation varies widely. I think we can all agree a human being in person is a lot better than that scratchy telephone, especially if what you need to talk about with someone is a fairly sensitive set of issues, because many of these populations are coming with much more than a history of losing their farm. There may be a host of issues, not only related to potentially the trauma of a climate-related disaster or other major displacement event, but also the things that happen afterwards when someone is in transit, when someone is unhoused and trying to find a life in a new place. And these can be really significant issues for children, for women, for everybody. And so having a trauma-informed approach to this population is, I think, pretty important and is not something that's always easy to accomplish. So big picture, as we're trying to think about how to get people to land on their feet, to provide good care as their doctors, and to advocate for a situation that is tenable for everybody and equitable, I think we need to be focusing on connecting people up with good healthcare and ideally with other psychosocial supports, whether those are families and informal communities or nonprofit organizations or something else. So very quick recap here, and then I think we'll have about 20 minutes for questions. We have talked about a bunch of climate effects, things like heat, storms, flooding, sea level rise, fires, particularly in California. We've talked about a lot of ways that these can affect movement decisions, whether it's short-term movement or long-term movement, short distance or long distance, and whether people have any agency over that choice. And we've talked a little bit about terminology and the difference, legally speaking, and in terms of practical access to services between refugees and people who may be migrating or maybe distressed migrants. So from a clinical standpoint, we've touched very briefly on some of the key points for trauma-informed care, providing language services, and providing long-term connections with care. But I suspect many of you have some things you would like to add to that conversation and some resources you would like to share. So I will pause there. My contact information is here, or you can get it from the organizers after if you want to chat more. And I am going to stop sharing my slides and would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dresser, for sharing your learnings and expertise with us. There is so much to learn and understand. So yeah, we'd like to open it up to discussion now. So anyone who would like to share their thoughts on the topic or of climate change and migration experiences in your practice, challenges, or questions, you may speak them out, unmute yourself, or put them in the chat, however you feel more comfortable. And I have a couple of questions from people who emailed them in advance, unless somebody wants to say something. So while you're thinking, so Dr. Pam Oitis asked, I want to learn the facts as we have them of the numbers / percentage of migrants at the US-Mexico border, as well as elsewhere in the world due to the climate crisis. That might be hard, but.
It's a really good question. I think it's not one that anyone has a concrete answer to. And I think this is because of two fundamental challenges in this area. The first is that you're trying to count people, many of whom do not wish to be counted. And so any number you come up with is going to miss people. The second is, what is climate related and what is not? Let's take a couple of examples. Let's say that I in Boston am living in my apartment very close to sea level, and there's a huge hurricane and I lose my home and find myself living with my parents for a few weeks, and then say, you know what, I'm done with Boston, I'm moving to California to join all of you. When I arrive in California, I would have chosen to do that. I'm a doctor, so I probably moved of my own choice and I'm presumably getting hired there. So am I a climate migrant? Well, probably not, but I did experience a climate-related disaster. Contrast that with if I was being measured when I moved to my parents' house right after that big hurricane. Well, in that case, I would be a climate migrant. And so figuring out how to define who counts and who doesn't for that number is very challenging, because at different stages of the migration, people may be moving for different reasons. I think from a practical standpoint, what really matters to all of us is how many people are on the move and what are the anticipated needs of those people and anticipated volume of people in the future, and what can we do about it. And from that perspective, I think a lot of the quantification is really important and is also going to remain fuzzy estimates. And that's sort of what we're going to be working with.
I think also, I mean, nobody's keeping that close track why somebody's moving from one place to another. So maybe it's something that will come out when we look back in hindsight, which brings up another question: what's being done to address the climate migration crisis, if anything?
Yeah, I think that efforts are in place and much more needs to be done. It's a challenging topic because I think, given the political climate in many countries right now, people are very uncomfortable talking about migration, and in some cases talking about climate change. And this is unfortunately something that is happening now, is probably going to be happening at larger scale in the future. There is work going on both through the UNHCR, which theoretically should just be dealing with refugees, and also the IOM, the Institute of Migration. They have been doing a lot of research on this. The World Bank has been doing a fair amount of research on this. And I think that is an important first step, is quantifying as best we can what the scale of this issue is, what the mechanisms driving it are, and that can then inform a conversation about what solutions might look like. I think it's also important that the populations on the move, the people who are affected, be engaged in some of these conversations. They have been notably absent from many of the reports I've read on this. And so I don't know necessarily what all of the perspectives might be from someone who's going through this process right now. Those are often voiceless people in this debate. In terms of what can be done, I think there are a few different philosophies, and it really depends what your end goal is. One thing that I think many organizations and people are aligned on is that supporting people to have good lives where they currently live is a desirable outcome. Avoiding displacement, avoiding migration, avoids a whole host of risks that come with displacement and keeps people with their community. So that is probably the best goal. In terms of how do we achieve that? Well, I think part one is we need to get the climate crisis under control. And so reducing greenhouse gas emissions is part of keeping people safe and in their homes decades from now. And the other half is investment in adaptation in impacted communities, fully recognizing that some climate threats are too big to adapt to, but some are not. And I would argue it's worth trying, even if it's a temporizing measure, because that's many, many years of life for many, many people where they're still with their community and may be safe. And so that's that bottom right box from Dr. Benveniste's plot of the population staying in place and adapting in place. That seems like a pretty good endpoint. That's what a lot of people would prefer, as far as we can tell. Once populations are on the move, it's really challenging, right? And this gets into a lot of the same humanitarian issues and challenges that we've been dealing with for decades, and that still have no really good answers in terms of dealing with the scale of people on the move. And so the more that we can prevent that, the better. And that means decarbonizing our economy and investing in keeping people safe where they live.
Thank you. And then Andrea Green in the chat put a question. Thank you for making this connection between climate and migration so clear. I always talk about immigration status as a social determinant of health. How do we elevate this concept in the climate change / environmental conversations?
Yeah, I think the question is, and if you're open to opening up your mic, I'd love to talk to you. In which conversations? Is this with policymakers? Is this with our colleagues in medicine or something else?
So, I was thinking about it in terms of talking to the environmentalists and policymakers, because I had the good fortune just recently last week to actually be at the TED Talks that happened. And there's so much talk about climate change, but nobody kind of connects it to what it means for people. So Bill Gates was there and he was talking about early pandemic response. He's going to propose something called GERM. I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but they're, and talking about public health issues and sort of looking at COVID, people are thinking about it, but I don't think people are really making the connection between the movement of people and climate change. And the fact that this problem is going to get to be more and more, and all the political instability, people just don't seem to talk about it on that level. So that I think the general public, people who aren't working with immigrants and refugees here in medicine, people aren't making those connections. And so I sort of feel like COVID brought up people understanding social determinants of health in lots of ways, making people's lives more difficult. But I don't think people are talking on a political or policy level or in a public forum so much about the fact that we have this migration crisis because of climate change. I just don't know that we're getting that point across to the public. So I'm curious as to how we as physicians might be able to elevate that conversation a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, my answer to that has been talks like this, and also talks like this delivered at staffers for my senators and other such people. I think bottom line, it's a fairly simple message, right? I just gave a 35-minute talk, but you could probably explain this in 3 minutes at a cocktail party and get the key point across. Like, climate change is happening. It's making it hard to live in one place. People move as a result of this. We are dealing with this in my pediatrics clinic. Here's what I've seen. This is going to be a bigger problem. What are we doing about it, sir? And that, I think, is a pretty powerful statement to be able to make. I think the answer is a lot of people making the same clear statement in as many forums as possible. And so I'm trying to give this talk and reach out to people such as yourself to, build energy around addressing this. Because I think the solutions to this align with the solutions to a lot of other things, right? This is well aligned with some global health and global development work that goes back decades. This is well aligned with a lot of immigration issues that have been also at the fore for decades, and is well aligned with a lot of what needs to happen for climate change mitigation. And so I think making climate change personal, as you alluded to at the beginning, is a really important piece of this. And this is one way to do that.
Thank you. And I love the idea of maybe figuring out a way to advocate through amplifying what you're saying and doing. And I'll talk to you maybe about giving a TED Talk.
Sounds good.
Barry, did you want to speak, or you're on mute still?
Can someone unmute him?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right. I'm a pediatrician. Obviously, I'm at the end of my career of seeing patients in the office, mainly because of COVID. I just returned about 2 weeks ago from going from Boulder, where you get off the airplane and you say, well, gee, there was 1,000 homes here, but they burned down because of a firestorm in the middle of winter. And then there were rains, and it washed away all the topsoil and took out the neighbors, et cetera. They're facing that crisis here. I fortunately am in California. We're pretty insulated from it. I have to tell you that you gave a remarkable talk. God bless you, but I'm personally overwhelmed by everything you said, and I can't begin to try to figure out where the approach to this problem would best be met. So again, congratulations that it's on your shoulders. But I want to tell you what I pledged to an audience at this conference 2 weeks ago, and I've made enormous inroads in the last actually 2 weeks, and that is four of the talks at this conference, actually 6 of them, were about a field called regenerative farming. I heard about regenerative farming 6 months ago after watching Fantastic Fungi, which I would encourage everybody to watch that movie. It's just a documentary. It's incredible. And then there's a documentary called Kiss the Ground. And after watching the documentary on kiss the ground, it was the first piece of hopeful, maybe there's something we can do. Maybe we can make a dent in which end of the curve we're in. I mean, we're going into a shitstorm, but we can be on the high end or the low end of it. And what I'm well aware of is that as a pediatrician I've influenced a lot of people's lives at a number of different levels in my career. I'm president of a 600-person IPA that I just told them last month I was sort of done with that. But I've written several books and on different subjects, and I'm aware that if you put your mind to something, you can do something. And right now, people are so overwhelmed by global warming, they're not doing anything. And the easiest thing to do is to deny it or just try to look in a different direction. And we as pediatricians are one of the last resources in America where people actually have some trust in us, certainly families. We're leaving a world to our children and our children's children, which is, you just turn the channels, you can see how nightmarish it is. And whether you're watching the news or whether you're watching The Walking Dead, it's a hellish world that we're painting. And we need to get people at every level involved. And for those of you who don't know what regenerative farming is, because I didn't know what it was, and I asked 20 of my smartest friends, and 19 of them had no idea what it was, and one of them said, I've heard of it and didn't know what it is. What it is basically is that for millions of years, we've had a world that's been a biome and an ecology state in balance. And with modern agriculture, we're converting farmland into deserts, and the desertification of the world certainly is contributing to these changes that we're having. And this movement of regenerative farming is going to farmers, most of which are planting a single crop subsidized by the government, with politicians passing laws that they have to buy these plant seeds and buy these fertilizers in order to survive. It's trying to get those farmers to start going back to the ways that the indigenous people have farmed throughout history, with the exception of the last 50 or 100 years. And the only way to get that impact is not to change the politicians who are currently getting all this funding from the lobbyists from big pesticide, big farming, but rather educate the public, which we have the gateway to, which is children and parents. So I'm setting up a program locally, and I've spoken with the school system, I've spoken with the state of California university system, which is tying together school gardens, which are about a quarter or a third of the schools. There are champions at those schools who are doing that and teaching them that by making the soil healthy, by not using pesticides, by not using fungicides, by not using herbicides, by not using artificial fertilizers, you bring life back, which means you bring carbon back into the ground, and you potentially can pull carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, it's probably pie in the sky to think this is going to make this all go away, but it's just as important as driving around less and making all the changes to put more poisons in the air. So I don't want to take your thunder, because I recognize this is a different topic, but when I tried to go on to look what the Academy had to offer, I saw nothing about regenerative farming, because really people don't understand that the earth, the soil, is really potentially right underneath everyone, and maybe our best link to getting the world to start moving in the right direction. So I left my email if anyone has any contact information from the Academy. And again, I thank you for the job you're doing for addressing a much more difficult problem.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think what you're speaking to also, it's worth bringing up a couple points. You sort of answered the question I often get in these, which is, wow, this is really scary. What do I do? I feel overwhelmed. And my answer to that is usually pick a solvable size problem that you can work on with other people and then work on it. And do not expect yourself to fix climate change by yourself. But if you link up with a team of people around something constructive, whether it's an educational initiative, a action that pulls carbon out of the atmosphere as you're talking about, or something else, working with a team on an actionable issue is going to be probably better for your mental health than worrying about this by yourself, and far more effective for your community.
Yeah. And start locally.
Yeah. All right. I think 2 more minutes here. Any other observations or resources anybody wants to share that they've found helpful in dealing with these intersecting issues?
I'm going to put into the chat right now, we have a list of resources that our Immigrant Health Committee did put together for some of the downstream effects of what we've been talking about. Thank you, Dr. Dresser. This has been so amazing. To Dr. Green's point, you know, I've been really passionate involved in the immigrant health side of things for a long time, and I've always had an interest in climate change. But I will admit, even before, in the early stages of us planning this talk, I sat down and I Googled, because I go, there's got to be a link, but I'm not sure how clear it is. And I feel like this whole experience of planning this talk and then hearing you share this information just makes it so crystal clear. And it is pretty wild that it feels like even within our medical community, this is not being talked about more, because it's playing out in our clinics, in our emergency rooms, in our hospitals, in our communities, everywhere. And I don't think I appreciated the link, even though I'm right up in front of it. So thank you.
This has been a pleasure. Great to see you all. Thank you for your questions and thoughts. And good luck
Thank
with
you
everything.
so much. And we're going to send to everybody after all of the information and the slides and resource list and everything. So thank you so much. Have a nice evening and happy Earth Day tomorrow.
Happy Earth Day. Take care, everyone.